So let's take a look at the box of the Palit Gamerock RTX 4090, which, as you can see here, it doesn't really show anything except that it's a 4090, and it really doesn't show the card itself at the front, so there's not a lot of information except for the name of the card itself. You can only see the card starting on the sides and on the top of the box. The real information is actually all on the back side of the box over here, as you can see, where they actually listed basically all the features of this card, such as the sync ARGB header that's on the card for you to sync the RGB to your motherboard, and then the DR spreader composite heat pipes, which is just some fancy name for vapor chamber plus heat pipes, I guess, which is supposedly going to work well with their Y formula fins, which is just weirdly shaped fins that's supposed to create turbulence and dissipate more heat throughout the heatsink, as you can see on the picture here, which also has triple fans, which they call the Gale Hunter fan. Again, yeah, that's just fancy marketing name for some fancy looking fans, I guess, that's supposed to work really well. So I guess we'll all see if those features actually work. But I guess the striking feature is the midnight kaleidoscope thing that they're always touting on the box, which is supposed to be that fancy crystal-like shroud that they put in front of the fans. So we shall see how that looks once the RGB actually lights up, because yes, that is actually fully lit by ARGB LEDs. Although during the off operation, it actually looks pretty decently clean as just a black crystal-like feature on the card. Now, before we take a look at the card, let's take a look at the accessories, which you of course get one of these adapters with every RTX 4090 cards, because you know there's very few power supplies that actually support the new ATX PCIe 5.0 standard as of now. So obviously you get those adapters, and you also get some of these weird connecting rod things, which you can use to support the graphics card, which to me is just kind of funny because it seems like the manufacturers are actually realizing just how humongous these cards are, so they actually start including some graphics card supports. And that was just now the ARGB cable that you're supposed to connect to your motherboard. Now for the GPU support bracket or rod, as you can see in the Palit card, it's actually quite useful because this card is actually literally 4 slots thick. Well, they call it 3.5 slots, but it's really actually closer to 4 slots, to be honest, and it's just a really massive card that's super thick and really heavy as a result. So I would think that some kind of extra GPU support is actually useful in this generation, and Palit has actually done quite a good job, in my opinion, for this card, because as you can see, there are these mounting holes at the front for screws that you can put in. And these kind of mounting holes are actually quite common in graphics cards because lots of OEMs actually use them to bolt graphics cards onto the cases to prevent them from shaking during shipping. And in this case, Palit used them to bolt onto their graphics card rod, which you can just screw onto using the included thumb screw onto the rod, as you can see me trying to do here. Although it is kind of difficult to put this in, but yeah, you basically just screw it into any of the holes you want, although the edge one is actually much more useful. And you can adjust the height on the rod itself to adjust how much the GPU is getting supported by the rod itself, instead of just using the PCIe bracket, for example, which is kind of a lot for a GPU of this weight. But you can also change the height of the rod by switching it to longer ones, as you can see here. And also you get one of these like rubber pads you can put on the end, so it can actually grip onto your case bottom. But that's enough about the accessories. Let's start taking a look at the graphics card itself, because this is actually quite a surprising graphics card in terms of the size, you know, aside from the looks and the performance itself. Because as you can see, this is a really huge graphics card, just like any other aftermarket RTX 4090. But it kind of makes sense considering that this card is the RTX 4090, which has 16,384 CUDA cores, which is absolutely a massive amount, even though that is still a cut down version of the Ada Lovelace core that's under this GPU heatsink, the 8102 core. It has 384 bits of memory bus, which means over 1 terabyte of memory bandwidth, over 21 gigabit per second GDDR6X memory from Micron. And you know, all these insane specifications means that it does pull quite a lot of power, which is why Nvidia started to go onto these newer connectors, which are meant to replace the typical PCIe 8-pin and 6-pin connectors, which these adapters are supposed to adapt into, because most people don't have those newer power supplies that have the new ATX 12VH 12 power PCIe or whatever it's called connector natively. So yeah, you're supposed to use this adapter, and to be honest, I really don't like this connector, because even though it can technically support more power because it has more pins, it just doesn't feel as robust as the older PCIe 6-pin and 8-pin connectors, because it has more pins, the pins are actually thinner and the plastics are thinner, and they just feel much more fragile to me. In fact, they only have a rating of 30 insertions, and as you can see there, I've already almost accidentally inserted the opposite way, which yes, you can't, but yeah, it's kind of confusing to use compared to the typical one, which is much more robust. And it is kind of stiff and kind of annoying to put in and out as well, as you can see. So yeah, I really am not a big fan of that, and hopefully they don't break easily, especially on these ultra expensive graphics card like this 4090. But yeah, it really does save space at the top though, because now you just need one connector. Although I would wish that there's some cards that actually just use the older triple 8-pin or quadruple 8-pin even setup, because those are just much more robust connectors than this, in my opinion. Now on the top side here, you can also see that Palit has added some bracing onto the graphics card itself to prevent it from sagging, because this is quite a long card and it is quite heavy. And they call this the anti-gravity plate, which is, it's nonsense marketing talk, but yes, it's meant to keep your card from bending and eventually breaking from the sheer mass of itself. Because this is, again, I keep saying, it's a really huge card. I've never held a graphics card this big in my life. It's not even a graphics card anymore. I would just call this a graphics brick at this point, because it's really that big. And it's just extra thick with all the cooling fins, as you can see over here, which spans basically the whole length of the card itself, which makes sense and is a good thing for the RTX 4090, because this thing does draw a lot of power at 450 watts. So you'd want all the cooling you can get with triple fans and a really huge heatsink that, with a short PCB can blow through the backplate and just straight through cool the heatsink instead of having to crash into the PCB and turn 90 degrees on typical cards. So this is getting more common now with the straight through airflow design. But yeah, Palit has also seemed to use some really high quality fans on these. Typically graphics cards fans are really thin and flimsy, while these ones are actually quite thick. These seem to be like 20mm thick fans, and the plastics that they use on the fan blades are actually quite sturdy too, as you can hear from the sounds when I'm tapping it. And yeah, they just generally look like really high quality fans, although we'll have to see how they actually perform once I test it out. Now the backplate itself, as you can see, has a brushed finish, which looks really nice, although the writings is kind of a lot on the back in terms of the warning, so they should probably reduce that, and maybe also change the position of the dual BIOS switch, because this is actually kind of hard to access. Like, you can't actually use your fingers, so you probably have to use a screwdriver, and I just hope no one scratches their PCB using a screwdriver changing that, because yeah, this is not a cheap card. And because of that, as you can see, it also has intricate engineering put into the card itself, which I hope will translate into actual performance once we test out the card. I mean, this thing the card itself is just a heatsink the whole way through with lots of heat pipes, as you can see under the fan there. Yeah, they have 6 and 8mm heat pipes apparently on top of a vapor chamber that spreads the heat from the GPU and the memory chips itself. So hopefully the cooling is actually super great, because at 450 watts, it's not actually that much higher than the previous generation RTX 3080 and 3080 Ti and 3090 cards, which are aftermarket as well. And those don't have nearly as much heatsink as this thing does. So the power consumption is not actually that crazy on the 4090, to be honest, in my opinion, because even the 3090 Ti launched with 450 watts, and those just ran just fine. And lots of them actually have overkill coolers as well that keep them under 60 degrees. So hopefully these 4090s and, well, this Palit card could keep itself under 60 degrees maybe, hopefully with maximum fan speed, which will allow some pretty good overclocking. So we shall see how this thing can do in actual testing. But yeah, the Shroud itself is pretty unique, as well as the backplate here, which extends all the way to 3 slots, as you can see, with venting, which is actually useless because this is a vertically oriented fin design on the heatsink. So, well, the only useful thing here is the 3 display ports and 1 HDMI, which is standard on pretty much every 4090, and I think it's a great thing to have because, well, lots of 4090s are going to be used with high resolution 4K high refresh rate displays which use DisplayPort. And for the looks of the Shroud itself, as you can see, it's quite unique with having the crystals, but I wouldn't dismiss it just yet because we haven't tested out the RGB lighting on this yet. So it might actually look pretty good with RGB, even though I'm not quite a big fan of it. But anyways, that's it for this short unboxing video. I hope you find it somewhat entertaining and maybe useful, although there's not much information I can give right now until the 12th. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and click like if you do, and maybe click subscribe to see the actual review of this card, and comment down below what you think of the new RTX 4090s, because in my opinion the power consumption is not really a big deal. 450 watts is pretty standard compared to even the previous RTX 30 series cards. Thanks for watching.